Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 7 lecture. So we continue our tour of international cinema this week as we go to Latin American cinema. So the chapter we're checking out in the book begins on page 427. It's pretty short. This is really just an overview. We obviously cannot do justice to such a broad subject matter in just 1 week. So the book really focuses on just 3 countries. The author of that chapter makes the point that really only in the biggest, most populous Latin American countries did you see the development of really like national film industries. So they single out Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil as the 3 countries that were big enough and sort of had enough resources to really have their own unique film industries and film histories. I would argue that we could probably update the book a little bit. Keep in mind it was published back in the 90s. So nowadays you can see a pretty vibrant film industry in a lot of different Latin American countries, even some of the smaller ones that the book sort of dismisses. But if we are thinking more historically, yeah, we're going to spend most of our time on those big nations. And this week, we're going to spend most of our time on Mexican film because our film for the week is an example of Mexican cinema. And I wanted to talk a little bit more today about the development of documentary filmmaking in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, which lasted roughly from 1910 to 1920. So that's really an interesting time in the history of cinema. We don't have to be experts on the Mexican Revolution itself, but we will talk a little bit about the kinds of movies that were getting made during that decade. Some very early documentaries and sort of newsreel footage of actual battle scenes and other sort of wartime activities. And that stuff was important both for what it did at the time, but also the influence it would have later on future documentary filmmakers, both in Latin America and here in the US. So we'll just sort of briefly cover the chapter, and then I want to talk about the film that we're watching this week. I'll provide a little bit of historical context. I've made some changes to our schedule. You guys might have noticed that if you're looking at the detailed class schedule found in the syllabus. So I changed the movie last week for our French film week. And I've also changed the movie for this week. Originally, I had The Exterminating Angel scheduled for this week, and that's kind of an example of the golden age, the classic era of Mexican cinema. So just like we have a golden age of American cinema, we have a golden age of French cinema, which we discussed briefly last week. We have something very similar in Mexico, and that's a famous film directed by Luis Buñuel, who's really a Spaniard. He came to Mexico later in his career and made several films there, but he was from Spain, began his career as part of the surrealist movement in Spain, and also made some films in the US. That was originally scheduled for this week, but I scrapped it because I felt like the subject matter was very similar to the film that we watched last week. So The Rules of the Game, like we talked about, was a satire of the sort of decadent ruling classes of France on the eve of World War I. Well, The Exterminating Angel is kind of a parody of the upper classes in Mexico in the years after World War II. So a slightly different era, obviously a different place, but very similar in terms of the characters, in terms of some of the social commentary, and the overall sort of satirical tone and style. So I felt like we've already done that. We already experienced a lot of that last week with The Rules of the Game. So I wanted us to watch a different kind of movie. So I chose something that's a lot more contemporary. It might still feel kind of old, but Canoa is from the 70s, and it's really representative of a later era of Mexican filmmaking. So just like we were talking last week about the French New Wave, which started like in the late 50s into the 60s, and it was really a response to that golden age, that classical era of French cinema, where you had a lot of comedies, a lot of period pieces, like sort of, lavish costume dramas set in previous historical periods, a lot of stuff focusing on aristocrats or sort of upper class heroes. great production value. It was sort of dubbed the tradition of quality. But then a younger generation of filmmakers comes along later and they reject a lot of that. They're bored with those kind of movies. They want to do new stuff. And that was really what the French New Wave was all about. We have something very similar in the States, starting around the 70s with New Hollywood, and we also have something similar happening in Mexico throughout the 70s and 80s, where you have sort of new filmmakers, this new generation represented by Felipe Casals, the director of Canoa, and some of his contemporaries, and they rejected a lot of the sort of tenets or characteristics of classical Mexican cinema. They wanted to make new kinds of movies. They were innovative visually and technically, and also a lot of them were sort of political. Canoa is considered sort of a political film. It's sort of it's got a political message, and it's very much a product of a particular time and place in Mexico. So we'll get to that a little bit more. But again, all of these different places, you should notice they have sort of a similar chronology, sort of a similar overall history, with sort of this golden age of like major studio productions, and then a response to that comes later. So we're going to get back into American film next week, and we're going to start experiencing the new Hollywood of the 60s and 70s and how it breaks with a lot of those older classic Hollywood traditions. So again, just kind of interesting to note that that happens in a similar way in a lot of other places. But just to go back to the very early history, as they point out in the book, cinema was first introduced to Latin America by representatives of the Lumiere brothers and other European filmmakers and exhibitors as early as the 1890s. And then they mentioned that in a lot of these countries, you had the first film productions following very closely after the first examples of exhibition in those countries. So in other words, not long after the first films were shown in a lot of Latin American countries, you had the first film productions in those countries. So they mentioned like 1896 in Mexico, 1897 in Cuba, Argentina, and Venezuela, 1898 in Brazil, so forth and so on. So that's kind of the early history. They spend some time on that in the chapter, and they also mention that in these early days, the most popular types of films getting made in Latin America tended to be documentaries. And that's going to be true for several decades. And these were often documentaries about like exotic landscapes or geographical formations, kind of, selling new exotic places to American viewers or other audiences that might not have been very familiar with those places. So a lot of these films were very much about beautiful scenery, or they featured sort of noteworthy local events like a military parade or some other kind of like cultural or political event that was going on at the time. So those were a lot of the early films that were getting made, like in the 1890s and the very early years of the 1900s. And that takes us to what I think is a very interesting sort of historical tidbit, and they do mention it in the chapter, is the fact that many Mexican filmmakers honed their skills during the Mexican Revolution, which, like I said, took place roughly between 1910 and 1920. So you had a lot of documentary filmmaking during that decade in Mexico, what we might consider like newsreels. These were obviously often not fiction films, although some of that footage would later get recycled and used in fiction films. But initially, these were meant to be documentaries, sort of like news broadcasts, trying to capture actual battles, trying to capture like what was going on during this bloody armed conflict. So that's kind of important because we're still very early on in cinematic history, obviously. We had documentaries before, like we kind of noticed at the beginning of the semester, the very earliest films we would probably classify as documentaries because they didn't have a narrative. They weren't works of fiction. They were just depicting sort of everyday life people doing regular things. So there was already a documentary tradition in many different places, but what made these particular films sort of more exciting and more interesting is that they were depicting warfare. Which would have been exciting or interesting perhaps to audiences who were not directly experiencing it, of course. And they mention in the book of an American film called The Life of General Villa, which came out in 1914, and it was about the Mexican revolutionary figure Pancho Villa, who some of you might be familiar with. He's kind of well known in our own popular culture, in part because he led some raids across the border into New Mexico, I believe, at around this time. But he was also a very important figure during the revolution in Mexico. So again, if you guys want to learn more about the war and about how it progressed and who Villa was supporting at various times, I would recommend going to Wikipedia or some other online encyclopedia. Villa has a good Wikipedia page on him if you want to read it, and you can find some other sources to read more about him as well. But he was an important sort of guerrilla leader, sort of like a militia leader in the north of Mexico, and there's a lot of legends and stories about the fact that he signed a contract, I believe in 1914, with what was called back then the Mutual Film Corporation, kind of an early pre-Hollywood film studio. Mutual would later get sort of consolidated or absorbed into the company that would later become RKO. And that was one of the big Hollywood studios of the Golden Age that we've mentioned before. But anyway, he signed a contract during the war with Mutual, and essentially Mutual got like exclusive filming rights. Like they had exclusive rights to film Villa's soldiers, to like film not only him, but also the men who served under him as they rode around and did maneuvers and like stayed ready. And in some cases, cameramen were trying to capture actual battle sequences, but as I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, that was often difficult to do, both for reasons of technology and just sort of logistical reasons, and the fact that these cameramen often wanted to stay alive, so they might not want to, maybe didn't want to always get in harm's way. But there's a lot of legends about it. There's legends that, Villa, stage battles at particular times or like executed people at particular times so the light would be good so they could capture it on camera. A lot of that's apocryphal, sort of tall tales, legends, not all of it's true. But he really did sign a contract with Mutual, and they really did have exclusive filming rights when it came to him and his troops. And he also, part of that contract stipulated that Villa himself would receive 20% of all revenue produced by these films that Mutual was trying to put together. So you had a lot of cameramen going out there and shooting footage during the war. And not just American cameramen during the making of that film, but also a lot of Mexican cameramen were doing this work, both before and after this particular film. So there are several names that are kind of important in Mexican cinematic history. If you're interested, you can look these individuals up, but these were like cameramen and early exhibitors, film exhibitors. So people responsible for showing films, but also people filming the action, and some of them would later become directors. But a few names to keep in mind. Salvador Toscano is one to remember because not only was he one of these early cameramen filming the revolution, but he also made Mexico's first feature-length fiction film. Well, not feature length, I guess, by modern day standards, but their first narrative film, Don Juan Tenorio, which came out in 1898. He was the director of that film. Toscano is often thought of as sort of the first director in the history of Mexican cinema, but he filmed a lot of stuff during the revolution, and a lot of that footage would later get lost. But a lot of it was exhibited to audiences during the war, and again, these were like newsreels, obviously in black and white, silent, but they showed troops, they showed, scared townspeople, Sometimes battles, not a lot of great battle footage, but sometimes you could see like cannons or like other kinds of artillery fire, and you could see generals and soldiers moving, talking, doing stuff on camera. So there were some others as well, the Alva brothers, Jesus Abita. There were other sort of innovative cameramen going out there and actually doing the work. So a lot of scholars today argue that these early figures were almost functioning like embedded photojournalists, which was an occupation that didn't really exist back then, but many of them actually traveled with some of these revolutionary generals or leaders like Villa. So that's what they mean by embedded photojournalists. They weren't just capturing action, they were riding with these militia groups, going from place to place and capturing footage as they went. So a lot of that footage would later get used in a number of different films. So Toscano himself would recycle a lot of his documentary footage from the Revolution in some of his later narrative films, his later fiction films. And that was a fairly common practice among some of those other filmmakers as well. So in many ways, scholars today will argue that the Mexican Revolution was sort of the first really well filmed major event. And it was sort of one of the first subjects for what we would consider today a compilation documentary, which just means a documentary that consists of a lot of footage that's been shot over a period of time. That's how most documentaries get made. But this was still early in film history. So a lot of these ideas, a lot of these concepts were still getting standardized, and Toscano and some of these other Mexican cameramen and filmmakers helped to really sort of create our modern understanding of what a documentary film is, how it functions, and how it gets made. So, kind of interesting to note. And then going back to the American film, The Life of General Villa. So remember, Villa signs that contract with Mutual. So Mutual sends cameramen and other technicians down there to kind of embed with Villa, to go travel around with him, document what he's doing. But they discover that when it comes to actually capturing battles, the technology was holding them back. You have to remember that back then cameras were very large, they were very heavy and bulky, and to operate one you had to put it on a tripod, and you still had to crank it by hand in order to operate it. So obviously you didn't want to get too close to live ammunition. You didn't want to get too close to the shooting, because it would be very hard to move the camera in the event that you would have to pick up and run or take cover or relocate. So they would usually set up pretty far away from the action. So you wouldn't get a lot of great footage of actual battles, but you could maybe see, an artillery bombardment. A lot of stuff would be captured in long shot. So you might see troops marching. You had a lot of footage of troops marching. Maybe, again, a bombardment, a siege of a city. You could also get some, medium shots or even close-ups of individuals doing stuff, walking, talking, conferencing, planning, getting ready for battle. But a lot of the executives at Mutual were disappointed at the quality of the footage. They weren't getting the really exciting battle scenes that they were hoping for. So what ended up happening, according to film historians, is a lot of these cameramen had to be resourceful, and they had to sort of recreate battle sequences in a way that would be easier to capture on camera. So they had a lot of different techniques for this. In some cases, they would just get the soldiers to sort of pretend, and they would get them to sort of reenact a battle that had recently occurred. And these would be guys that had maybe participated in that battle, so they kind of knew what happened, and they could sort of reenact parts of it. And again, you would really just need a few pivotal shots. a few shots of people firing weapons, a few shots of people like running or taking cover behind something. And if you got enough of those individual shots, you could put them all together during the editing process and make it look like one coherent battle, when in reality it was just a handful of guys posing and pretending like they were fighting. So sometimes they would do that. There's sort of this one, I don't know if it's true, but it's sort of this legendary story that one time this actually happened during the Revolution. A film crew had some American like extras. I think some of them had been servicemen, and they got the Americans to play, one side, and they got some Mexican troops to play the other side, and they were like, hey, reenact this recent battle so we can get some good footage here. But it got a little heated, and eventually the two sides started to actually fight for real. Like, they actually started shooting at each other. So that was a pretty realistic scene in whatever movie it later appeared in. But they were often recreating or using some creative editing techniques in order to give the appearance of actually capturing fighting. But there's some interesting interviews with some of these cameramen. Of course, they're all dead now, but a lot of them talked about their experiences later, and stuff was published about their work. And some of them would say, they could capture some battles in like more confined urban areas, like within cities or towns, when the different sides were fighting like within the city or town. You could get closer to the action. And if it was kind of street by street fighting, you could set up your camera like on a street corner, and you could just capture the action as it went by you, as people ran and, return fire or whatever. But one problem that they ran into when they did capture really good, realistic, actual, genuine footage, often, as you could imagine, it would be pretty graphic in nature. You would see people getting shot. You would see blood and gore. So a lot of that stuff would later get censored by the studios or the news organizations who were contracting them out. So a lot of the good stuff would never make it to audiences, and much of what audiences did see and thought was real would have been staged, would have been recreated, often after the fact, maybe using real soldiers. Again, like when they were working with Villa was very cooperative, and he would agree to reenact stuff, stage stuff. He would have his soldiers perform, various maneuvers on horseback so the camera crews could capture that. So going back to that movie, The Life of General Villa, I don't think it even survives anymore, at least not in a complete version. Nobody really watches it, but it's still kind of famous because one of the assistant directors was this guy named Raoul Walsh, who would go on to be a pretty well-known Hollywood director a little bit later on during the sort of high point of the silent era. And Walsh told lots of stories later in life about working with Villa, lots of funny stories. And he said at one point they were trying to set up this one particular scene where Villa was going to sort of ride by on horseback. And they were going to capture him as he, rode by the camera, but he was going too fast, right? He was going too fast, and they couldn't really capture it. So they kept telling him to go a little bit slower, to not spur his horse on quite so, intensely. But they did take after take after take to try to get it right. And Walsh said, Villa was very cooperative. He didn't mind doing multiple takes because he knew that the movie was going to kind of burnish his image, make him this sort of larger than life figure. He sort of wanted to be a celebrity, and he certainly became one. And to this day, a lot of people still know who he was, in large part because he appeared in a lot of these films. Now, in that particular film, I don't think Villa himself appeared as an actor. In fact, well, maybe he did at times, but they used Walsh. They used Raoul Walsh, who later became a director. He played a young Villa. Right, he played Villa as a younger man, so Walsh also acted a little bit. And Villa appeared in a lot of this newsreel footage that did circulate in both Mexico and the States. So just kind of interesting to think about. Again, a lot of these Mexican documentary filmmakers were really learning on the job. They were learning how to capture movement. how to capture action, and how to do the kind of editing work necessary to assemble all of these different shots into something that was coherent and, easy to follow for an audience, and kind of told a story, kind of had a narrative, even though, again, it wasn't a fictional narrative. This stuff was really happening, or at least they were trying to capture what was really happening. So those techniques, again, they later became sort of standard for documentary filmmaking, and they became very important both there and here. So kind of cool to keep that in mind. But just to go back to the general history, by the 1920s, as they point out in the book, there was a very strong Hollywood presence in a lot of Latin American countries. So by the 20s, a lot of the Hollywood studios had set up shop in Latin American countries, and they would often have like distribution arms operating in those countries, and also they would frequently control exhibition. So a lot of movies that were getting sold to exhibitors in these countries, and then therefore a lot of the movies that were getting shown and watched by audiences were Hollywood films. So as they mention in the book, for a long time, domestic film production in a lot of Latin American countries was kind of low, because a lot of what they were watching did come from Hollywood. But that was like the exception to that over time would be found in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, those countries that were sort of big enough to sustain film industries of their own. And you started to see distinctive genres developing in those countries, genres that were distinct to those particular cultures, those particular sort of histories and places. So, they mentioned gaucho movies in Argentina, very much like our Westerns. Gauchos are very much like American cowboys. They sort of function in a similar way. They're kind of folk heroes. So those movies became popular in Argentina during the silent era, kind of based on adventure, these gaucho characters doing various, heroic deeds. They mention in Brazil, you kind of had a native genre there known as sort of like the backwoods bandits. I don't know how to say that in Portuguese, but sort of a similar genre, a similar kind of character type, but unique to Brazilian culture. Something that was recognizable to a Brazilian audience, but maybe would not have been as familiar to others. And in Mexico as well, you had sort of, native local genres that developed as that film industry started to take off more by the 30s and 40s, and you entered into the golden age or the classical era of Mexican cinema. So they had a lot of rancheras, like various types of melodrama, but also comedies, a lot of the same types of genres, frankly, that we had here. But again, a lot of them were sort of unique to Mexican culture and Mexican history. So once we get into the golden age, again, that's often thought of as like the 30s and 40s and kind of extending up until the 1960s. So just a few names that you could look up or learn more about from the golden age. Emilio Fernandez. You may have seen him before. In addition to being an important director, he was also an actor, and he appeared in a lot of Mexican films, but he also acted in a number of American films. So you've perhaps seen him in an old Western. He was in like The Wild Bunch. He was in a couple of films directed by Sam Peckinpah in the 60s. He was prolific both as a director and an actor, so he made some really important films in Mexico during the 40s. The cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa. I hope you guys read about him in the chapter, because Figueroa is important not just in Mexican cinematic history, but he also is the cinematographer on some pretty well-known American films. So you might have heard of a couple of these titles. He did Night of the Iguana, which came out in 1964. He did Kelly's Heroes, which is one of my dad's favorite movies, starring Clint Eastwood, a war movie, came out in 1970. So Figueroa was a really important figure because he did, before those movies, he did some really big ones in Mexico. And again, he's a cinematographer, so he's in charge of a lot. Obviously, he's in charge of the camera work, so he has a very important role when it comes to visuals and kind of, the presentation of a lot of these movies. And he's often credited credited with creating a lot of images, a lot of imagery that a lot of American viewers often associate with Mexico. And in some cases, these are maybe slightly stereotypical, but they became sort of indelible images in large part because of some of the movies that Figueroa worked on and some of his camera work. So certain shots of certain landscapes or women in sort of traditional attire, like men in sombreros, again, sort of stereotypical images that people might associate with Mexico or Mexican culture, but a lot of that was sort of, at least in part, exported through some of their popular cinema. And Figueroa worked on a lot of those movies, later went to Hollywood, and continued along an illustrious career. And some of the famous actors of that time, Pedro Infante, who is also a musician, Maria Felix, Dolores Del Rio, just a lot of different names. But that was the golden era. We're not actually watching any movies from the golden era, just because I felt like we might be a little bit bored. We might have been a little bit bored by rules of the game. I don't know. But I wanted to find something a little bit more modern, something that might be a little bit easier to sink our teeth into. So that brings us to Canoa, A Shameful Memory, our film for this week. So we don't need to be experts on Mexican history. We don't need to know a ton about context, but we need to know a little bit in order to fully understand this movie. I think it's an entertaining film just on its own, even if you don't know much about the historical context. It's really an interesting style that we see here, because the movie really starts out very much like a documentary. It feels like a documentary. We're in this small town. We're learning about this place. We're talking to some of the locals. But one of the locals that we talk to or hear from early in the film then begins to sort of function as our narrator. He begins to talk directly to the audience. In sort of film world, this is a move often referred to as breaking the fourth wall. And you guys have seen this. It's a pretty common thing in a lot of contemporary film, when you have an actor or performer in the film who's addressing the audience. So we call this kind of breaking the fourth wall because it's like, to suspend our disbelief, we often like to imagine that what we're watching is real, that the actors are, at least obviously portraying people that were meant to take as real. So we sort of regard them as being sort of within these four walls, kind of separate from us. But when one of those walls comes down, and you can also think of like a theater, the way a theater is arranged. But when one of those walls comes down and the performers are talking directly to us, that's kind of a meta moment, like we've talked about before, metafiction, fiction that calls attention to the fact that it is fiction, calling attention to the fact that this is a movie, that people are watching it. So that technique is on display here. But just when we think that we're getting some kind of meta documentary, it morphs into a somewhat more traditional narrative fiction film, and we meet the main characters, who are these young guys who are employees at a university. And they are mistaken for students, and they're ultimately lynched in this town. Two of them, I believe, are killed. The others are seriously hurt. They're beaten. They're terrorized. And this is all based on true events. So in order to kind of understand what's going on with these characters, or why this happens to this group of characters, you need to know a little bit about the Mexican student movement of 1968. So again, we don't need to be experts, but a little bit of historical context does help here. So 1968 is a pretty important year, like in Mexican history, and you had a lot of political and social unrest. And a lot of it was centered around the student organization. So you had this sort of broad coalition of college students from a lot of Mexico's leading universities. and they were marching in the streets and sort of agitating for political and social change. They were very much, most of them, were very much opposed to the sort of current authoritarian, ruling party in Mexico. So they wanted change, they wanted new leadership, and they were often out in the streets demonstrating, protesting, organizing, doing a lot of stuff that might look kind of similar if you've watched documentaries about like the civil rights movement, similar things that were sort of similar practices of like nonviolent protest or nonviolent demonstration that you saw from like Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders in this country. But oftentimes these student protests or demonstrations would be met with force. A lot of times the police, or in other cases like, army units would be called out to sort of disperse the students. Often these turn violent. Many students were arrested. In some cases, students were killed. So there were a couple of pretty high-profile massacres of several students at the hands of police or military forces that were called upon by, Mexico's ruling party. So that's what's going on. That's kind of the backdrop. It's not always directly referenced in the movie, but there are several times where you hear the characters referencing what's going on with these student protests, and they talk a lot about the students, what's going on with the students. But it's important to remember, it might be confusing at times, but these guys, although they are mostly pretty young and kind of college age perhaps, they themselves are not students. At least that's what we hear them say on multiple occasions. They are employees of the university, Puebla University. Okay, so they work there, but as they try to explain to the townspeople, they themselves are not students. So they're a little bit conflicted. There's that scene like in the coffee shop pretty early in the film where they're sort of talking about this, and they're not quite sure where their alliance falls. Like they're kind of sympathetic to the students in some cases, but they don't totally identify with the students because they themselves are not students. So at one point, one of the guys is like, we're workers. We're not students. We don't really share all of the students' concerns, all of their beliefs or whatever. So some of them are kind of on the fence. Some of them do seem to support the student movement. But clearly the people in this small town of San Miguel, Canoa, they are not fond of the student movement. So what you have to understand is a lot of these student coalitions or movements were supported by the Mexican Communist Party. And some of the students were leftist, like some of them did identify as communist or socialist, but certainly not all. It was a very diverse group of protesters who had many different needs and desires and affiliations and belief systems, but they were often all lumped in as communists. And they were often covered that way by the media, and they were often referred to that way by people who were hostile to the movement, who, were sort of supporters of the government or supporters of the status quo. They didn't want big social and political change, and they were opposed to what the students stood for. So you kind of need to understand that to understand what the priest is doing in this town. When the priest calls these guys communists, when he claims that they're, communist operators who are in the town to steal from people, like it sounds outrageous, and obviously it's not true. I mean, we can see that these guys aren't that. They're there to go mountaineering. They want to hike La Malinche, the famous, volcanic mountain that's found near that town. But this was a popular slur. This was a popular stereotype that was often used against the student protesters. Oh, they're all communists. They hate Christianity. They hate, our traditional way of life. They're going to kill us. They're going to steal from us. They're working on behalf of foreign, communist governments. They're working for the Soviets or whatever. And oftentimes that wasn't true. I mean, it was true that some of those students did identify as communists, but it was a blanket stereotype that was applied to a lot of the protesters, and it's being applied side to these guys, and they're not even protesters. They're not even out there in the streets demonstrating. So it's important to remember that they are being mischaracterized. They are being mislabeled. They are being slandered, really, by the priest. But the people in this small town really just don't trust any outsiders, and they especially don't trust people from the cities. So we are in the Mexican state of Puebla. But San Miguel, Canoa is a small town. It's very rural, and as we learn in the opening, when we're kind of in documentary mode, this is an economically impoverished place where the people don't have much, life is hard, and they really don't feel any identification or allegiance with the student movement. And many of the students would have been from more urban areas. They would have been from cities. Again, these were some of the leading universities in Mexico, including the University of Puebla, which is where these guys work. So Puebla, in addition to being the name of the state, is also the capital city of the state. So these guys are from the city, but they're visiting the small town. And we can see they don't get a very enthusiastic welcome. The townspeople are very hostile. They don't really understand what they're doing there. They show up to go hiking, in the middle of a rainstorm. So immediately they're met with suspicion. The townspeople don't really believe them when they try to give an account of sort of who they are and what they're doing there. And the priest tells everybody that they are communist agents sort of working with these student groups, and they're here to pillage the town and potentially kill people and take all their stuff. So that's what's going on. That's a little bit of the historical context, and that's sort of a very rough, brief explanation of sort of what's going on in the plot. So the film is obviously providing commentary on this. It's sort of showing us what happens with mob violence. What happens when you get a group of people who are very angry, and they sort of share this perceived common enemy, and you work them up into a frenzy using the power of the media. I mean, I do think we could probably think of some other examples of this throughout history. I mean, it's not unique to any particular country or group of people or culture. It's just kind of a human thing. There's been mob violence throughout human history in all parts of the world, and it's often sort of carried out by some kind of charismatic leader, some kind of thought leader, somebody who can get a message out and really hammer it home. And there's always been ways to do that since the beginning of recorded history. But of course, what we see in the movie, the main tool that they have is radio. And they have these speakers kind of mounted throughout the town so everybody can hear the radio broadcast really at all times. You don't have to have a radio of your own in your home to be able to hear the broadcast. And we hear the priest and we hear these other kind of propagandists get on the radio, and they are telling the people in the town what to think. And they are telling the people in the town that this harmless group of guys who's there to go hiking are actually communist agents, and that we need to kill them or we need to get rid of them in some way. And that's what ends up happening. But I want you guys to really notice some of the interactions between the characters and the people in the town. I mean, yeah, we definitely see a sort of mob mentality in the town. We see some angry people who maybe aren't acting logically, but not to defend their behavior, but there's also maybe some moments where the city guys are maybe behaving in a way, acting in a way that's offensive to the locals. Maybe they're not always as respectful of the local customs, the local ways. So we see this kind of cultural divide, right? We see this kind of separation between what might be considered like an urban middle class in Puebla, and that's what these guys are. right? The urban middle class sort of clashing with a rural, more poor population that might have, more conservative politics. They don't share maybe certain political or social beliefs, but they're also really separated just in like the way they live, their daily routines. They're so different. That it seems like there's just a lot of misunderstanding. Obviously, there's misunderstanding on the part of the townspeople, but the guys, the young, college employees, they're guilty of misunderstanding too. What they're perhaps most guilty of is not quite taking the threat seriously enough. Now, a couple of them seem to be more concerned than others, but perhaps they don't get out of there quickly enough. They don't realize maybe the full extent of the danger that they're in. So, yeah, you can maybe pick out some political messaging here. The film was sort of a political statement just for the simple fact that when it premiered in 1976, we were only 8 years removed from these actual student massacres that happened both in Kanoa, but also in other places back in 68. So we were less than a decade removed from the actual events, and this was sort of an attempt to treat that event with accuracy, to try to not recreate every detail. It's not a documentary, but to try to recreate some sense of why it happened. Provide an explanation, sort of explore the psychology of the mob, and sort of show how the mob violence can spread and how it can take root in part through media, but also through stereotyping, scapegoating, which are things that people have always done in various ways. But in addition to its political content, which we can observe, but we're never going to be in a position to understand it fully as sort of outsiders. Unless you have a lot of knowledge of Mexican history or culture, or that is your history and culture, you're always going to be a little bit removed from the political or social commentary. But I also so that's okay. We can understand it enough to be able to analyze the film. But what we should also notice is that the film often functions much like a horror film. And that's why it's still celebrated as a really significant artistic achievement today. It's not just, some sort of documentary style recreation of an important historical event. It's also held up as just masterful filmmaking. Not only that peculiar shift in tone and style as we go from documentary to something more resembling a typical fiction narrative film, but also the sense of dread that kind of builds and develops throughout the film. I think Felipe Casals deserves some credit for that. And again, as audience members, we might apprehend the danger that the characters are in a little bit faster than some of them do. Right? This sense that something bad is going to happen. And some of that gets a little bit telegraphed because of the structure of the film. We see the actual lynchings in flashback. We actually get the info delivered to us up front in that opening scene in the newsroom when the reporter is taking the call, and we learn what happens. We learn who dies and who doesn't. But still, as we actually watch the narrative events progress, there is a sense of dread. It might be considered suspense, but it's often been called by critics and scholars as kind of a horror-esque mood that gets created here. And even though it is depicting real events, there's almost something maybe kind of supernatural about the mob and sort of their the way they become sort of possessed. They're not possessed by real demons, but they're possessed by this kind of religious fervor. They're possessed by a lot of anger and hate. And it makes them do awful things, much like a possessed character in a more typical horror film. But also, and a few scholars have pointed this out, not only are we afraid of the mob, but we can also maybe kind of understand the fear that the mob feels. Right? We as viewers probably don't side with the mob. We don't side with their sort of religious, over-the-top, anti-communist fantasies because we realize they're not true. But we understand that this is real terror that the townspeople are feeling. Like, they're not faking it. Like, they're not pretending to be scared of these guys. They're not just using fear as a pretense to be mean to these guys because they want to be. They are legitimately worried that these guys are going to do bad things in their town. So their fear is real. And that makes them, more easy to manipulate because, they are going through this very intense emotional state, and the priest is manipulating those emotions and turning it into actual violent action. And another scholar that I'm kind of ripping off here also points out that it's very similar to a horror movie in the way that it ends. And she argues that a lot of horror films conclude in a particular way, right? They sort of show us like a return to normalcy oftentimes. And that can often, do many things. Like, it might sort of be a relief to the viewer, but it's also frequently a reminder that evil or whatever that bad stuff was that was driving the plot is sort of still probably there. It's not eradicated. It might sort of go back beneath the surface. People carry on with their lives, but a lot of horror films leave us with the impression that the evil is still there. The danger is still there. It might just be submerged. Maybe the characters thought they got rid of it, but they really didn't, at least not entirely. And they argue that we have something similar here at the very end of the film, because we see the inhabitants of the town like celebrating a feast day. I'm not sure who the patron saint is, but they're having a celebration. And they're doing this sort of celebratory procession or march through the streets of their town. So they're acting like nothing happened. This is just a few days after the brutal events depicted, near the end. So, back to normal. They killed a couple of guys. They nearly killed others. But now, back to their daily routine. And also that march, that parade should put you in mind of what we saw at the very beginning of the film, where we also get a march. But what we were seeing back in the beginning were like the family and friends of the dead young guys. It's like a funeral procession. But going on at the same time was a military thing, or maybe the military was there with, supporting the townspeople's procession. So you have two different parades that are actually happening in different directions. And they're sort of like mirror images of one another, right? So you have like the official parade that's sort of serving as a mirror image of the funeral procession for the dead guys. And then we see the march at the end that's a reminder that for the townspeople, life goes back to normal. We do get a little bit of a epilogue there, and we're told that some of the people responsible for the worst violence were charged and convicted of crimes, but I think only like 2. And clearly a lot of the other townspeople were involved or complicit, and many of them probably never suffered any direct consequence. So again, without a great knowledge of that era of Mexican history, some of that symbolism, some of the political commentary might fall a little outside of us. We might not fully understand all of that, but at the very least, appreciate the movie as a genre movie. It's a suspense. It's a horror film. It's based on true events, but it's fictionalized, and it often is sort of structured like a horror film. It feels a little bit like a horror film, and of course, the events that it's depicting are quite horrifying and all too real. All right, so that's it for this week. I hope you guys enjoy the film. Give it a chance. It might feel a little different, a little strange at first, but I think it really picks up steam, and I think you'll get caught up in the narrative. It's really pretty fast-moving. It's really well made. It feels modern, and to this day, Mexican filmmakers continue to really be influenced by that film. It plays a very important role in their cinematic history. Okay, so I'll see you guys next week. Get in touch if you need anything.